Good evening everyone. Thank you very much for attending this talk on beauty and what it can show us of the human soul. I would like to say, as Catherine's pointed out, at the risk of turning you off, that I am someone with merely a passing interest in the philosophy of aesthetics, and my formal training is in political philosophy. However, one of the excellent parts of art and aesthetics is, as I hope to show, that we do not need a formal training in the appreciation of fine art in order to be appreciative. Instead, the aesthetic gaze is a natural part of the human person's life, as he naturally sees the world around him and discerns what he likes and what he does not. However, I do think that I am qualified to talk on the human soul because I have one. Part of the talk I'm giving today is to make this very point. Sympathy and empathy are an essential part of being human, and to be human is to possess faculties capable of stirring these sentiments. Interestingly enough, empathy is a product of empathy. My ability to empathise with your life and state of being is ingrained with the recognition that you feel or are capable of feeling partly the same. This is not to say, however, that with human beings, if you've seen one, you've seen them all. Empathy carries in itself the capacity to recognise that empathetic beings see the individual as an individual, not merely as one in a multitude. But to risk getting ahead of ourselves, it would be wrong to make such claims without at least understanding something beyond pure speculation. Similarly, we also need to understand why I am talking about beauty in connection with the human soul, never mind the question begging of whether the soul actually exists. After all, so runs the phrase, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Does this mean that it's pointless to discuss beauty? Well, I say not so. Rather, we need to recognise that the phrase itself is badly misunderstood. It does not mean, for instance, that the beauty of a thing flows from the person looking at it. To suggest so is to imagine that anything can be beautiful, even something so patently and obviously disgusting, if just one person was to say so. And vice versa, it would suggest that something beautiful can cease to be so if everyone were to turn away from it and decide it is not worth their time. No, the phrase beauty is in the eye of the beholder means that beauty as a concept can only be apprehended by beings with an aesthetic gaze, or in other words, humans. We often hear, for instance, that art is entirely subjective. I am not and never have been convinced of this view, partly because there are two entities in the moment of artistic appreciation. These entities are indeed the subject that is looking at the art and, of course, the art itself. For instance, when I stare at the work of Van Gogh, such as A Peasant Woman Digging, there is a human person, me, a subject, looking at something, a piece of art, an object. Clearly then, there is an objective element to art, as it is concerned with objects. But art is a many-headed thing. Art in the human world is in part painting, architecture, music, aroma, poetry, and even speech. So how can we know what the object is that we are appreciating in the aesthetic gaze? Indeed, if we cannot know what the object is, can we know what art is? And if art is, at least in part, subjective, we all tend to agree that it does exist. So why is this the case? And what use, if any, does art have to the human person? What I would like to do today then is to first explain what I mean by the human person, and hopefully not in a way that overcomplicates the very obvious fact that he does exist. But in this explanation, I hope to also show that the human soul is a real entity, one that cannot be grasped by the material explanations of biology or chemistry alone. From this, I will then turn to art as an experience of appreciation in the human person, before showing how this appreciation flowers in the transcendental experience between persons, and what that transcendental appreciation shows us of the deep human need to be seen and recognised. It is important when dealing with philosophical concepts to try to understand what we mean by them. Given that this talk is concerned with the question of the human soul, there is certainly a large task confronting us. Indeed, I am hardly the most qualified to speak on such a thing, never mind present my own definition of it, but in that sense then all I can do is hope to quote the work of better writers rather than myself and aim to do them justice. However, I do want to begin with an anecdote. In the 1970s, there emerged a horrendous report of a young girl in Los Angeles in California who had been abused by her father. The extent of the abuse is not appropriate to share here, but what is significant in the abuse is that he prevented her from interacting with any other people to such an extent that she was never exposed to a significant amount of verbal communication. In other words, she could not speak at the age of 13 when she was discovered. This girl was named Jeannie and referred to as the feral child. As they are wont to do, psychologists and other scientists rushed to examine the girl and judge the extent of her stunted development, though curiously at the time no moral philosophers seemed interested in this poor girl. Over the course of a year, Jeannie was able to learn basic linguistic tools such as words and phonetics, but was not able to acquire a first language in the way that you and I do. One specific obstacle for Jeannie was grammar. She could understand words, but struggled to understand their relation to one another and spontaneously construct sentences. Her limited development was then jeopardized almost entirely when she was put under the care of California State with the so-called care facilities into which she was moved, damaging the improvement she had made, such to the extent that she nearly lost all of the language skills she had so far gained. One thing that she never learned to do either was understand social behaviour. Now, this story is sadly true and one that has pervaded psychological study since the 1970s. And while it would be wrong of us to pry into her life too far, the example of Jeannie gives us fascinating insight into the developmental importance of other people and the social nature of the human person. After all, what is this thing that calls itself me? Such a question has to be our starting point. Now, it's a philosophical truth that the individual exists. After all, I, Jake Scott, am speaking to you now, not another philosopher and not another person called Jake Scott, as remarkably common as that name might be. But the image of the purely autonomous individual, which is a philosophical tool used in the early Enlightenment, cannot be understood as an entirely accurate depiction of the life of a person. After all, we cannot be said to be brought into this world distinct from every other human to have ever lived, and even if that condition were imposed on us, we would then struggle to enter the human world necessary for our existence. Indeed, it is necessary for us to exist in a social world. As Aristotle described us, we are social animals, and it is a simple matter of our nature that we seek bonds that last beyond immediate necessity, both because we cannot physically survive in isolation and because we find ourselves enriched by the presence of those around us. It was not, however, until the philosopher George Friedrich Wilhelm Hegel that I believe a suitable philosophical reason was given to us as to why we need the other in order to become a person at all. After all, as Hegel notes, we are conscious beings by virtue of our ability to recognize the world around us and realize that consciousness in the process of actualizing our agency, usually by making things. His notes on property, for example, observe that since property is the existence of personality, my inward idea and will that something is to be mine and not enough to make it property, to secure this end, I must take possession of it. And he says that a person puts his will into a thing is just the concept of property, and the next step is the realization of this concept. The interactive will, which consists in saying that something is mine, must also become recognizable by others. If I make a thing mine, I give to its predicate mine, which must appear in it in an external form and must not simply remain in my inner will. Now that's fairly complex, but what Hegel is more commonly known for is the leap from consciousness to self-consciousness, when I realize that I am more than just a body, I am me, because, and this is important, I encounter another agent of the will in the world. This is Hegel's famous master-slave dialectic. As I am driven by the need to actualize myself in the world, so too is every other human person. But, as I do not know this when I encounter them, I attempt to actualize myself on them, perhaps by forcing them to do what I say. But they do the exact same to me in reverse. As a result, the escalation of actualization results in the near death of one of the two of us. However, and to me this is where Hegel is particularly clever, the process of the master-slave dialectic has revealed to me that I am not alone in the conscious world. Here then, because of this plurality, I am able to separate myself from the universal consciousness, what Hegel calls Geist, but which we can call spirit, mind, or will, and thus become self-conscious. Because this requires a plurality of consciousness, I refrain in the final moment from killing the other and render him instead my slave. Now, what's the point of this seemingly violent tangent? My point is that human beings implicitly recognize the other as an external and equal agent. Hegel's dialectic might not have resulted in a particularly equal relationship, but Hegel is not that concerned with equality, at least not in the first instance, but rather the equality is implicit in the fact that both agents are agents and are equally capable of self-consciousness. More importantly, it is only in the interpersonal world of others that we recognize ourselves as agents. Therefore, a person is more than an individual as an agent of the will, but is one capable of recognizing and attributing desires both to himself and to others. After all, I know what I want, but what I want is not necessarily the same as what I have evolved to do. One is inevitable and the other is intentional. That which is intentional is the marker of personhood. It is my capacity to know, for instance, that I enjoy poetry, want to walk my dog, drink wine, and occasionally present long-winded talks on philosophy. But I also enjoy these things, and I do not do them simply because I must. Likewise, I am able to understand that when I sit and talk with friends who do not enjoy poetry, prefer cats to dogs, drink whiskey, and could not stomach philosophy on a good day, it is because they do not enjoy those things that I do. It is why we are able to, in the realm of action, attribute blame and causality. If someone was to hit me, they may very well be within their right to do so, but unless they have a particular disease that forces them to do so, they would also be responsible for hitting me. It is because of this intentionality that we are able to speak in a language of meaning and motive, why we can use words like trust, loyalty, and faith. A dog who sticks with his master does so, for instance, out of conditioned acceptance, and as much as I love mine, and she no doubt feels a chemical reaction similar to love, I can't say my dog is loyal to me in the same way that my best friend is, because my best friend's loyalty is one of choice. My ability to speak of loyalty grows out of my inability to control the other whose loyalty I am asking for, and why Xenophon said that willing obedience is better than forced obedience, and why Aristotle stressed that virtue grows out of a choice to be virtuous. So we can say, therefore, that a person is a socially behaving individual. My capacity to be who I am rests on the recognition of others who seek the same in me. Now, obviously I am not continually dependent on others for my literal existence, and we are some good distance from Hegel's supposed master-slave dialectic, but what matters is that the social world in which we live is essential for the realization of the person. And in the realization of personhood, we implicitly recognize the other. When I look out from my personhood through my eyes to another person, I am struck by the sudden sense that there is a whole other being confronting me, over whom I have absolutely no control, and more importantly, no claim to control. And as the master-slave dialectic shows us, this otherness goes deeper than a mere external being. Each person is capable of ascribing meaning to the world and realizing that meaning by making the world correspond to that ascribed meaning. For instance, if I am to imagine that a block of wood would work as a chair, then the fact that I am able to make that chair, or at least learn how to do so, is evidence of my capacity to actualize meaning onto the world. On a more simple level, if I was to take a place where a significant moment in my life happened, the fact that I am able to associate a part of my personhood with that spot of land is a major part of the aesthetic gaze, which I shall explain further. At this point, you might reasonably ask, what bearing does this have on aesthetics and art? Why do we need to know what a person is if we are to understand art? Art, after all, is subjective, and therefore any attempt to talk of the person in relation to art will flounder on the recognition of art as connected only to the individual. Well, the answer is yes in part. In truth, art is subjective insofar as it tells us something about the subject, the person who is holding the art in his aesthetic gaze, by which we mean the capacity to discern and judge the appearance of the thing. But why do we need art for that? Why not just a Rorschach test, or even better yet, a mirror? The need for art is what I hope to illustrate here. All art is quite useless, declared Oscar Wilde, and in doing so, he summarised the traditional discipline of aesthetic appreciation and therefore beauty. Art is useless, thought Wilde, because its aim is simply to create a mood. It is not meant to instruct or to influence action in any way. It is superbly sterile, and the note of its pleasure is sterility. In other words, though we may engage in artistic exercises for a decided upon purpose, for instance to express a personal grievance, a political goal, a moral statement, and so on, a work of art may have a purpose, but art itself is not prescriptive in inciting any action that follows the interaction with the art. A poet may sit down, for instance, to generate a poem that will make another person who reads it cry from happiness. And if in the process of another person reading it, she too will feel the same ecstatic joy, then that is merely a happy accident. But not all poets will do the same. And even if they did, they would not do just that alone. Poets might write upsetting things or uplifting things. In other words, an art style is not by itself prescriptive. We cannot say that all poetry is happy, for instance. And therefore, while artists engage in work of art for a purpose, it is the purposeless of art itself that allows such artistic freedom. By the same logic, we don't say that all poetry is political. Instead, the aesthetic discipline says that art is something in which we engage, as either artists or as an audience, for its own sake, first and foremost. This is not to say there are no formal rules for art in itself. The production of music, for example, is a standard against which to enjoy or to judge the enjoyability of a piece of music. Now, if you think this is incorrect, consider when the poor production of a song has obstructed your own enjoyment of it. We can say essentially that music is the consciously enjoyable assemblage of artificial sounds. The subjective interpretation of enjoyment is part of that which I talk about above. And so any production that obscures the original intention of the piece to produce enjoyable sounds has thus marred the artwork and therefore made it bad. But what takes the superbly sterile product as produced by the artist and transforms it into a pleasing thing for some and an ugly thing for others? Why, for instance, does some people enjoy the Beatles but I can't stand them? Why do some people enjoy Allen Ginsberg but another person might think that Allen Ginsberg does not hold a candle to Emily Dickinson? Now, this can be understood as the prism of judgment. Each individual will encounter the artwork in his own way, and because judgment is such a personal thing, that means that no artwork can ever produce the same identical feeling in every audience member. Each person has his own judgment to work on, but that's not a concern of mine. What is a concern is the exercise of judgment as a method for understanding, appreciating, and creating art. If there is no reason to engage in art, does this stop us from doing so? Well, obviously it doesn't. Here I think some semantics are important. I would differentiate between use and utility. Utility implies purpose. A utilitarian interaction between two people would be centered around a purpose. Perhaps, for instance, a transactional one in which I buy from you an item in exchange for a set price. Once we have fulfilled the purpose for our interaction, we interact no longer. The utility of the interaction ceases to exist. But a useful interaction finds its use in itself alone. Consider, for instance, your friendships and what they mean to you. Do you value your friend for what they can do for you, or do you value them for who they are? If it is the former, then you will cease to value their friendship when their utility expires. But if it is the latter, then even if a temporary utility has been fulfilled through that interaction, you will continue to interact with them because you find a use in their friendship sui generis. So artwork can be useful, but the use follows the art and not the other way around. We often return to artistic works that we have appreciated before. For instance, I enjoy rereading some poetry more than others. Why is this the case? Surely, if I have read the poem once and received the message interred in that poem, my enjoyment has been fulfilled and I have extracted all enjoyment from the poem that I possibly can. Well, this view is mistaken because it is based on the utilitarian conception of art. This idea that a piece has a use to convey a message, and once that message is received, the artwork is no longer valuable. The medium does not matter. But if this was the case, then I would not even bother reading poetry. I would simply ask for a synthesis of the poem and extract what message I could from that. Instead, I read poetry because I enjoy the rhythm of words, the cadence of a verse, the syntactical inversions that alter my understanding of a thought, the interactions between sounds, and so on. And in doing so, I find a use for the artwork, even if the poem contains a specific message that the artist intended. If I told you, for instance, that the Iliad was an epic poem with a moral on the foibles of pride and hubris, that would not be the same experience for you as reading the Iliad itself, and not simply because I have a dull voice. The Iliad is an enduring piece of work for the beauty that it holds within it, for the descriptions of the shield of Achilles, or the tragedy of Hector, or the misery of Priam, and so on. Finally, therefore, useless things matter to us because of the vacuity of their utility. To illustrate this, consider perhaps the most commonly digested form of art, music. Now, I enjoy listening to punk music, as do several of my friends. Some of us enjoy the exact same songs, but when we talk about them, we often discover that we do so for entirely different reasons. Perhaps it might be the pace of the song, the passion of the vocalist, the synergy between vocals and rhythm, the melodies, or even the lyrics held within. But because none of these elements are held to be preeminent, or for instance that a song begins with a disclaimer, I want you to focus on the lead guitar in this song, we are able to share in our enjoyment for the piece despite disagreeing over why we find it enjoyable. The absence of utility, in other words, allows for a plurality of use while maintaining artistic wholeness. It is the uselessness of art that allows us to find a use for it, either as artists or as the audience. I may, as an artist, choose a particular form of art to express a message in a particular way, and in doing so I am providing a utility to my piece of art, but I am not providing a permanent use to that art form universally. Similarly, as an audience member, I might find a use for a piece of art, but that does not preclude others' own uses that they find in the same work. Thus, the uselessness of art allows for a discovery of use. Here we can turn to the question of the interpersonal. So I've just spoken about the use of art at the personal level as finding the meaning of a piece of art in the personal judgment of the person. But if the personal is informed by the interpersonal world, perhaps we need to consider what role, if any, art plays in the interpersonal. Now, our lives are made up of little moments of meaning. From our morning routines to our good luck charms, we wrap ourselves in a world we construct to feel a degree of control over. But beyond the basic utility of certain practices, we furnish these things with enjoyable gildings to make them feel personal. The same is true of the interpersonal world. We shape and personalize practices to make them feel as if they are ours, from the celebration of birthdays, to the spectacle of weddings, down to the observance of the passing of another life. We take occasions that bear no practical relevance to our day-to-day lives and show that they mean something. It is out of these shared expressions that culture emerges, and from culture, community. In this world we make, there are three distinctly aesthetic forms of culture: rituals, symbols, and myths. Each may be related to the other, and in fact it is almost essential for culture to endure that the three coalesce. Consider Christmas. The myth of the Christmas celebration is that it was the birth of Christ, from which you may take sincerely or symbolically, and literal symbols adorn the myth, from the religious symbolism of the nativity scene, the Christmas star, or angels, right the way down to the secularized Christmas tree. While the ritual giving of presents, now ubiquitous, keeps the ceremony and celebration alive, the more devout of us attend Mass or pray. What I want to examine is each of these three elements, their particular significance, and the role they play in the construction of culture and the creation of community. A ritual, in the cultural sense, is not taken alone, but requires a group of people in order to be recognised as cultural. So as I say, we may each have rituals that we perform each morning in isolation, from the necessary, such as showering, shaving, or having breakfast, to the unnecessary, but those remain mine or yours, and they hold distinct meaning for a single individual, perhaps because of the good luck they bring, or at least the security that they reassure us of. But these are not rituals. They are simply habits, and when we try to explain those habits that we keep and their significance to ourselves to another person in a rational way, we might appear mad. Perhaps it is a sign of the truth of this that we often explain the significance of habits in an emotional manner. I could say, for instance, that every morning I write in my diary because it clears my head and readies me for the day, thus appealing to the irrational but sympathetic side of humanity, rather than the rational side that might consider such a practice universal in its application. Some would consider writing in a diary every morning a waste of precious time. What demarcates a ritual instead is the sharing of it with another soul. And I say soul specifically because it would be dismissive to consider religious rituals as mere habits. For instance, prayer is not a habit, but a communication with God, and thus a communal practice, even if that communication is between the material and the transcendental. Returning to this world, if we may speak concretely in terms of culture, as I set out to do, a ritual can be summarized as a regular practice between two or more people. As I mentioned above, part of the usefulness of art is its lack of utility. It is not designed for a particular use, and therefore a plurality of uses may be found in it according to the plurality of the audience observing it. Culture is specified by a minor derivation. A simple utility underlies the ritual, which provides a degree of limitation to that plurality of meaning. The purpose of the ritual may be obviously biological. As I say, we need to eat, but there is no need to make ceremonial dinners to elaborate, or it may be historically contingent. In Lithuania, for instance, the Christmas meal is eaten on Christmas Eve, in which they normally consume carp or herring instead of the Western turkey, which is usually a nod to the historical absence of turkey or game bird in Eastern Europe, but the abundance of fish. Therefore, we can say that there is a utility behind a ritual, but the aesthetic element is the uselessness of the gilding and ceremony that we afford to it. And in doing so, we open up the interpretation of meaning to the plurality created by art. When we join one another for a meal, the biological necessity does not dictate that we do so in public. Instead, that is our desire to reaffirm our bonds of friendship or family that require us to eat together. If eating was the purpose, we would do so alone. And therefore, communal meals hint at a deeper meaning, but it is a meaning derived by each member of the communion and not dictated by the utility. Consequently, rituals invite us to actively reaffirm our communal membership by taking part in the ceremony of community, and in doing so provide us with the basis of group identity. One exception to this rule is the historic weight behind rituals that often limits the plurality of meaning, as I say above. Specifically, religious rituals. For instance, they carry with them the weight of divine significance, such as the ritual burning of candles at Hanukkah, Or we might find similar instances in nationally important rituals that are burdened with potentially prejudicial meaning, such as the burning of the Guy on the 5th of November in England. But as time goes on, meaning can fall away or can be replaced with new meaning, reflexive to the community that carries on the ritual, instead of simply ending with each generation. Well, the reason for this is simple. As much as rituals provide a community with an identity, a community provides a ritual with life, breathing energy into them and keeping them alive for the next generation, as well as adapting them to contemporary needs. After all, a ritual only becomes outdated when a community stops doing it, and not the other way around. And by taking part in these rituals, they become real to us and precious as a result. Whereas rituals are intangible practices that are brought to life by the people who do them, symbols are different. They are, instead, physical manifestations and distillations of the meaning of those rituals or traditions that communities care for, and as a consequence, reflect the significance of the ritual even in isolation from it. Furthermore, acting as a distillation of meaning, symbols are a bridge between the material and the transcendental, and so often evoke great emotional responses from those who value them, and in this way become conduits for the individual to access the values of the community behind them. You might think of flags, or of the monarchy, or of Lady Justice, or so on. This is particularly significant for the extension and deepening of community in our daily lives, as it is what allows us to carry or keep with us reminders of the identity to which we belong. For instance, this is one of the reasons that Christians carry crucifixes, both as a reminder of the significance that Jesus made for humanity, but also as a symbol of belonging to the global and holy community of Christianity and the Church. Regarding the question of utility in aesthetics, symbols, like rituals, have a utility behind them, as they are usually created for a purpose. But this purpose is instantaneously related to a more concrete event or circumstance, or even a ritual in itself. Flags are such an example. Flags are typically designed to reflect the community they seek to represent, as for instance the Union flag does, and consequently become focal points of the community itself, and as a result become opportunities for members of those communities to reaffirm their membership. This is part of the reason citizens often swear on flags, or, in a slightly less nationalistic way, football fans wear regalia or outfits adorned with their team's colours, and it might be worth noting there the possessive noun. Therefore, symbols are not only reflections of the meaning we give them, but are physical representations of the community they bind together. Finally, myths reside in the realm of the transcendental, and they are usually clouds of lies behind which the truth shines like a sun, distorted and fragmented but present nonetheless. Myths offer a motivating ideal of membership, a sort of fictionalized goal to live up to. In the strictest sense possible, myths are not entirely true, hence the deliberate choice of the word myth. Instead, they are stories told of and by members of our community, or patrons, or even the community as a whole, with who we feel an affinity by virtue of our membership, reinforced by the rituals that bind us together and the symbols that remind us of this. By virtue of their retelling, they are often disfigured, with some parts diminished and other parts exaggerated, but usually in a way that stirs the spirits and rouses the emotions. Of course, the myth must bear some relation to the truth in the face of the link between memories and fact, but it is natural that as fact becomes blurred by fiction, the animating myth takes hold, and the community it binds together makes it part of its identity. Consider the Second World War. During the opening years of the war, Britain stood alone, hammered by Nazi rockets, bombs, and the threat of invasion. It is in the face of this monstrous threat that Britain, cut off from the world, stood stoically against the Nazi war machine, and as we know, would keep calm and carry on. Except that wasn't technically true. Britain had many allies, least of all its imperial territories and the United States, and the famous red and white poster was never actually used, but was propaganda planned in the case of German invasion. But those words have a power to make us feel proud. The idea of a small island standing alone against a continent-wide malicious empire makes us feel some sense of belonging. Myths are what link us to the community beyond our own time, by drawing a line of continuity from the past to the present, and by our own design from the present to the future via their telling and retelling. The stories of the myths are then distilled in those I've discussed above, such as rituals and symbols. In rituals, we reenact the most tantalizing and communal moments of those myths we share, such as the receiving of communion, the exchange of gifts around the Christmas tree, the sharing of vows in marriage, and so on. And in symbols, these myths are made corporeal, such as the Keep Calm and Carry On poster. Without the spirit of the Second World War behind it, however, it would just be another array of letters on colour. But with the memories of Dunkirk, of D-Day, of SAS missions, and most importantly the Blitz, the poster becomes a symbol of the Second World War, of British spirit and sentiment, and by extension inspires a connection beyond the here and now. Rituals, symbols, and myths are the building blocks of the aesthetics of culture. It is hard not to use these words interchangeably, which is perhaps indicative of their connection and authenticity. But if I was to use symbol briefly as a stand-in for all three, we can see that these building blocks become symbols of community, as epicenters of loyalty and membership around which we coalesce. We come together to reaffirm our membership of the long-standing community they represent, and therefore leave feeling enriched for doing so. These centres of community, by extension, become constitutive of our social identity due to the role they play in our social life. So what does this experience of aesthetic culture show us? As I say at the beginning, the human person does not, and indeed cannot, exist in abstraction from other people. He might be an individual, as an autonomous being who can act and respond to immediate circumstances, but his personhood is a contingent fact, dependent on the presence of other consciousnesses to enable his own consciousness to flower in the dialectic. In this interpersonal world, where meaning is not just constructed, but communicated and shared, the aesthetic becomes a dimension capable of imprinting that shared meaning on the world. So we can turn here back inwards on the causality to understand what this shared meaning shows us of the person. Indeed, we need to be seen in the interpersonal world. In fact, it is a condition of the world that we are seen. As Roger Scruton said, the encounter with the individual is what makes art so supremely interesting. We, the audience, have set our interests aside in order to open ourselves to what another person is, says, and feels. It need not be new, but it must at least be his. A work is original to the extent that it originates in its creator. It shows us the world from his or her perspective, draws us into a sphere which is not our own, and enables us to rehearse the possibilities of feeling on which an ideal community, a community of sympathy, is founded. So when we are seen, truly seen, we are almost disturbed. We feel in the depths of ourselves a sudden nakedness twinned with a rush of excitement, perhaps in the rush of blood to our cheeks, a tingle in the depths of our stomach, or in the crawling sensations up our spines as we realise that we, in the eye-to-eye moment, have attempted to cross the existential gap that the transcendental is felt within. I, a conscious subject, have opened myself up in the moment of vulnerability to another conscious subject, and risked a sort of existential nakedness in which my social self is carefully laid aside for a moment. When we are truly seen, not merely in the sense of passing in and out of another's vision, but seen in a sense of understanding, I realise my own existential and social nature. I exist as a person because I exist alongside other persons. Art has a similar effect. Art sees us, though of course it has no ocular nerve. But in the moment of appreciation for a piece of art, we feel seen. This is because art affirms our human selves by showing us the presence of another human self that does not necessarily feel what we do, but certainly feels as we do, as an intentional and self-conscious being. We find, however, that some forms of art are more immediately arresting to ourselves. For instance, if I was to walk past a waste skip and see Tracey Emin's My Bed, I probably would not notice, except for the fact that it's already a famous work of art. After all, a skip usually contains a mattress, vodka bottles, and discarded children's toys, but it does not contain, for example, the torso of Michelangelo's David or the Starry Night of Van Gogh. If I did see these, I would probably pause, even just for a second, partly because it would not usually be there, but more importantly because it would not belong there. Now, this thought experiment was replicated suitably in a recent discovery. In May of 2019, a marble head of the Greek god Dionysus was discovered during an archaeological dig in Rome. Now, you might say that any archaeological dig is likely to turn up a piece of ancient art, as this is what archaeology does. But what is striking is the statement made by the dig team, specifically that extracted from the ground, it revealed itself in all its beauty. But what does this and the example of Emin's bed suggest to us? Perhaps it would just mean that I am snobbish about art, but perhaps it could mean something else. I think it shows that the aesthetic gaze's immediate capacity for discernment, by which I mean the capacity to see beautiful things in the thing itself. If we take Emin's bed, for instance, I do not think we can reasonably say that there is beauty in the thing we are looking at. Indeed, the very point of Emin's bed is that it is disturbing, but the artistic reason for it being disturbing is unexplained in the aesthetic appreciation. You find this need for explication and explanation to be a common trope in modern art. Very often, next to classical Baroque sculpture, Raphaelite frescoes, Renite architecture, or Wagnerian compositions, you have a title of the piece and little else. Next to modern statues, paintings, buildings, or songs, you very often have plaques and pamphlets of what the piece is meant to reveal, say, or look like. Paul McCarthy's modernist retelling of a Christmas tree, that it is meant to be a green, abstracted image of a tree, put up in Paris in 2014, was one such egregious example. Or take Damien Hirst's incredible, literally incredible piece, The Physical Impossibility of Death in the Mind of Someone Living, which was a tiger shark preserved in formaldehyde. One of my favourite offences was this piece I saw in Birmingham a few years ago, a cement mixer lined with neon strips. Considering it was next to a 2-foot by 4-foot piece of exposed brickwork, which was another installation, as I was led to believe, I sincerely mistook it for a piece of discarded construction material. It was only when one of the attendant guides leant in to tell me what it was meant to symbolise that I finally learnt what it was about. Now, I have since forgotten, but one thing that I did not forget was the absence of these attendants in the classical halls. This matters because, quite simply, if you have to be told what the artwork is, it is not art. This is because it cannot be appreciated for the thing in itself, but rather for the story behind the thing, which means that you're not really appreciating the thing anymore. In this, the person who has made the art has not attempted to cross the transcendental gulf, because they are not concerned with saying something to anyone. They are just concerned with saying something. They could just as easily scream into the void and make the same point. Art does not seek to tell you what to think or feel in advance of your encounter with it, as I show above, and any artwork that makes the attempt to do so is not attempting to reside in the interpersonal world between free persons. Art that cannot admit the subjective interpretation of the person who looks at it is not really art, because it is not prepared to reside in that community of sympathy that Roger Scruton identified. Instead, in another of Scruton's penetrating observations, it is an object that has the word me scribbled across it, when really it should have us. To make some concluding remarks then, and to consider the question once again, what does the philosophy of aesthetics show us about the human soul? Quite simply, it shows that the human soul is deeply interpersonal, acting as both the agent of the will and as the part of us that seeks recognition. When we create a piece of art, just as when we observe a piece of art, we extend our will out in an attempt to feel and find another agent of the will, and that can come in the form of another person or in the form of art. If I write a poem, I am attempting to put into words a part of myself, not just to put it into words, but to feel that it is seen, and that I am not alone in that feeling. But even if I am alone, at least that requires someone else to have seen and affirmed the sentiment that I have written into the poem. To make this a little clearer, when I am attempting to share my view of the world in a piece of art, I am not showing someone else the world I inhabit, but I am showing them how I see the world we inhabit. I am attempting to cross that transcendental gulf and create a bond that goes beyond mere words and looks. In doing so, I hope to create enduring images that the sympathetic community can find value in beyond its immediate message. This is why the archaeologist pauses at the marble head of Dionysus, sees a face, and not simply a chunk of marble. Thank you very much.